Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us tonight. Last week, we looked at the importance of the program for Marxists and Marx himself, and the necessity, particularly of the maximum bit in your program, i.e. socialism, and what socialism is, to help avoid going into dead ends and towards opportunism. And tonight we're looking more at the question of structure and democratic centralism, concretely the internal and external life of the SPD at the time of Marx and Engels. And joining us tonight is Kevin Bean. As usual, he's going to do the introduction of about 30-40 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions and contributions from the floor. Thank you for joining us, Kevin. Take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Tina. Good evening, comrades. Tonight's talk is looking at the organizational and party life of the SPD, really from the 1870s into the early 20th century. It's a rather long period, and in many ways, it's a period of some sort of great changes in German socialism. The anti-socialist law, for example, from 1878, 1879 up until 1890 is a period when the party is operating under conditions of sort of clandestinity. But also, it's a period in which even when the party is made legal, there are various restrictions on its activities and indeed on political activities in general. And of course, we also have a period in which the political system in Germany, the Kaiserreich, although democratic in some senses, has many undemocratic elements in it. So although there are plenty of opportunities for socialists to organize and to advance their politics, it's not by any means an ideal or perfect situation, perfect legality, or indeed perfect political conditions. The talk is primarily historical, but as with all of these talks, I suppose there's a contemporary resonance, and I hope that that will come out. And indeed, I will make some, references to that as I'm going through, particularly because the question of parties, and particularly of what sort of party we need, has been very much in the fore. Not only have there been a number of attempts at new initiatives really in the last 25, 30 years or so from the New Labour period, but of course the triumph of Keir Starmer and his current rightward shift has made many left members of the Labour Party consider their position, and there's been a lot of discussion about a new type of party and indeed what the nature of that party should be. And I suppose one of the purposes of looking at the history of the socialist movement is to try to see partly what comrades in the past felt about these issues, but also because it does have some sort of concrete lessons for us. And I would suggest that in many ways this period is one in which there are quite a few lessons which I think we can take from. Certainly, it has until very recently been a neglected period. The basis of my work is not original research in German. I don't have good enough German to do that, and I have to rely, like lots of other people, on translations. And Comrade Ben Lewis, who spoke last week, has done many translations and indeed has written on these topics, and I draw a lot from his work. The same with Mike McNair, who's a regular writer in the Weekly Worker, but also a number of accounts either on the Marxist Internet Archive or in various secondary books on the history of German social democracy. One of the interesting things that's come out in the past 10 to 15 years have been a number of local studies and indeed more detailed studies about the party's activities and how it functions. And of course, the other point we should remember about German social democracy is that it did leave behind it in this period a tremendous amount of literature, both party newspapers, but also magazines. Die Neue Zeit, which is a theoretical journal which was widely influential. Clearly, it was required reading for Marxists throughout Europe, and famously, Lenin had the complete run of the journal, and indeed, wrote in it and was clearly influenced by it. But also, there was a very a clear body of evidence about the activities of the party in things like minute books, in the records of the party conference, and the minute books of the party leadership. So what we have is an absolute wealth of material, and much of this is still only now being looked through, and large amounts of it have not been translated, certainly into English. And it means that much of our understanding of the German social democracy comes through that crucial period in 1914, when we have the war crisis, the war credits crisis, and so views on German social democracy and its leadership are very much sort of seen through that prism. And then, of course, the role of the German right, the German social democratic leadership in the Weimar Republic, and particularly the murder of Luxemburg and Liebknecht, all, in a sense, color our views of its history. And so, these are both opportunities for us to look at the work. So I just want to sort of take comrades back very briefly to talk about the sort of nature of German social democracy as it would have appeared in the 1890s. The party, as I said, had its origins in its form then in the fusion of the Lassallians and the Eisenachers at the Gotha Conference of 1875, the Gotha program, which I referred to in a previous talk. And in the 1870s and on to the 1890s, the party grew in electoral support and in membership, so that by, for example, 1890, it received 19.7% of the vote and had 35 deputies in the Reichstag. It was made illegal by the anti-socialist law. This law forbade the party to exist, but it did continue to exist in a number of ways. First of all, the law did not prohibit socialists to stand for the Reichstag. So in the elections in the 1870s and the 1880s, individuals were able to stand, and although they couldn't stand under a party label, they were clearly standing as a socialist in that way. So that again gave them a degree of freedom. Above all, they were, as deputies in the Reichstag, the elected deputies were able to speak, and indeed they intervened on all political issues, sometimes at the risk of imprisonment or fines. And their speeches, certainly in the Reichstag, were given the status of parliamentary privilege, and so found their way into newspapers. So that was something of a loophole, and they exploited it considerably. The other way that the newly developing Social Democrats organized themselves was as an underground party. They published a newspaper, Sozialdemokrat, from Zurich, and smuggled it into Germany. And there was the famous sort of red postal system, a series of couriers and others carrying the newspaper throughout Germany. And through that clandestine system, you get the rudimentary party organization, particularly in the form of trusted, very bad translation from German, but the Vertrauensmänner, the trusted people who were the sort of local contact points for the party. So the party was banned, and indeed party members were imprisoned, and they were restricted. I wouldn't want to give the idea that this was a very lax system. It certainly wasn't comparable to the 20th century dictatorships, largely because of the technology of control was less developed. But it certainly was repressive, and people did serve terms of imprisonment. They faced blacklisting at work and all the usual patterns. Now, when the party was made legal in 1890, it in a sense sort of sprung up from that underground existence. The parliamentary group, the Fraktion, had in effect operated as a sort of de facto leadership and communicating back and forward to Switzerland, and then using the Social Democrat as a way of developing ideas and communicating to their members and supporters. They were able, in a sense, to keep a sort of shadow party in existence. But the real growth of the party is, of course, in the 1890s. And it's then, I suppose, that we see the sort of classic period of German social democracy. And this is the period in which German social democracy does really sort of give its full flowering, I think, very much forming in the famous phrase, state within a state. It built on the traditions of the clandestine period, but it in a sense could now operate reasonably openly. And in this period, it builds its party membership, it builds its organizational form and structure, and it builds all the various sort of support mechanisms that a party would need. And it becomes very much a model for European socialists. Lenin, when he writes in What Is to Be Done, refers quite directly to the German Social Democrats as a model. And he talks about the way that they penetrate really all areas of society. And that, in fact, far from them being a sort of narrow sort of sect, or indeed in comparison with Tsarist Russia, sort of underground grouping, they have influence, they have contacts everywhere, and they're looked to by all parts of society, where even those who oppose them want to know what the socialists are thinking and talking about. One of the ways that this type of network developed was through local party organization, but it was also through the development of sort of supporting mechanisms such as newspapers, magazines, and of course a whole auxiliary life. When we use the phrase a state within a state, there are other examples of this type of social organism. In some countries, the Catholic Church functioned in this way. Indeed, in Germany, with the Centre Party, and particularly in the Kulturkampf period in the 1870s, the Catholic Church had its own sort of network of things like schools, churches, obviously, social institutions, and so therefore was able to maintain its existence. And German social democracy had, in a sense, something of the same. And of course, this extended from the political through to a whole range of activities. Looking, for example, at a local study in Halle in Saxony, we can see that in the 1890s, in the middle 1890s, the Social Democrats are not only organizing political meetings and rallies and demonstrations, but they're organizing discussion groups, they're organizing theater, they're organizing social activity. So in that way, you can see that this is more than just a party, and indeed it's, in a sense, a movement which does increasingly become a way of life. Now, how this was achieved, and indeed why it was achieved, I think is significant. It's often argued, for example, that this reflects the experience of the underground period. And I think that is true. I think there's an element of truth in that, particularly the the role of the Vertrauensmänner, the sort of trusted activists, and indeed the idea of a sort of common party culture being formed through struggle. There's also an argument that German society in this period and indeed later is often made up of various sort of associations, and that all that the socialists do is, in a sense, not, but they don't copy them, it's just sort of quite natural. And indeed that's true, I suppose, in many different countries. You have similar things in Britain, in terms of social organizations, trade unions, and so on. All of these things, function in this way. But I think there's also a political point here, which is both arises from quite conscious strategies, but also from maybe the particular historical developments of German social democracy. And that particularly is the idea of what the function of the party was, and indeed how it was going to operate. And I suppose this did grow out of a German tradition in the workers' movement of education, of convincing workers, of turning them from being, for example, non-political or indeed apathetic in relation to politics, to becoming socialists, but then becoming active, conscious socialists. In other words, that education and what we might think of as the formation of socialists, not just people who voted socialist or voted for the SPD, but were actually conscious of that. They were conscious of the party's aims, they were conscious of its program. And that means that education, and particularly in both the informal sense of newspapers and magazines, but also in the more formal sense of libraries and indeed local party schools, and of course the central party school, which in a sense functioned as a sort of institution of higher education in which leading Marxists taught and discussed with activists. So this I think is not just simply an accident. I think it is a fairly conscious strategy. It's also, and we can see this not just in the writings of Kautsky, who of course is one of the more significant figures in the party in this period, but in others as well, is the idea that socialist consciousness will need to be developed. This is the discussion about the so-called fusion formula, about the nature of the labor movement, and that workers will develop independent working class organizations, but they need to be given a particular form, they need to be given a particular political content, and that is the job of conscious socialists, that it is not, for example, a spontaneous or indeed a natural activity, and that the job of a party is primarily educative initially, but then also to develop that class consciousness and to develop that class power with a link to a conscious revolutionary program, which is why Erfurt, I think, was so significant. And many of these developments that I'm talking about come from Erfurt in the 1890s. The other issue is that questions of organization were taken, I think, fairly seriously. And after the party re-emerged as an open party, it, in a sense, replicated some of the patterns of the underground, but not as a clandestine party, but in its relationship between the center and what we might think of as the localities. And this is where the democratic centralism idea, I think, arises out of these particular conditions. Germany was a large state. It had a large population. It was in many ways, even in the 1890s, it was still a state in the process of formation. And indeed, as comrades will remember from some earlier sessions, when Germany was in the process of unification, some local particularisms, particularly the distinction between the South and the North, were quite significant in that way. Also, the clandestine period meant that it would be difficult to coordinate things nationally. And so a lot of initiative fell inevitably to the local groupings in that way. So what we had with the SPD was a local a set of local organizations, initially in states or Länder, then local organizations in towns, cities, villages, and so on, but also with a very clear central leadership, quite a small leadership, initially about 5 comrades, I think. It was later extended in the early 1900s, 1904, I think, to 8 comrades. And what develops is a very different type of political organization to that which had really been in existence in the 1860s, and indeed, had been the most important form of labor organization, the Lassallean form. So when the party came together in 1875, as we know again, Marx had been concerned about the political concessions that had been made to Lassalleanism. But in organizational terms, the Eisenach form of organization, I think, really predominated, and it was this that was to come through. Lassalleanism was very centralist. It was essentially a form of sort of labor dictatorship or labor monarchy. Lassalle and then his later followers, such as Schweitzer, essentially ruled the party as monarchs, essentially laying down the line of the monarch, laying down the line of the party. And although they were accountable to party conferences, there very much was the emphasis on the leader, very much a sort of cult of the personality in that way. The term, of course, is a much later one. The Eisenach model was much more democratic, and it emphasized, I think, 2 things. First of all, an individual party with party membership, not a series of sort of loose local groupings. Again, comrades will remember throughout this series, we've talked about the historical idea of a party, and many of the models of parties, indeed the very phrase party, certainly as employed in Britain and France, was of a much more sort of amorphous grouping. Indeed, in those states where there hadn't been mass parties, particularly in bourgeois politics, they were essentially groupings of notables and parliamentarians. And when people talked about the party, they usually meant the representatives in parliament. You can still see an echo of this, for example, in the British Conservatives, who will talk about the party and then we'll talk about the voluntary party, meaning their members outside of parliament. Now, of course, the Eisenachers had a different model, which was a model of a party which is made of individual socialists and is a democratic party in that way. In other words, it's a party that's committed to socialist revolution, and its aim is to propagate socialist ideas. But it's also one in which the party conference and the meeting of party members is supreme. So although there is a leadership that's elected, the Vorstand, the sort of leading group, as it were, a leading committee, this is accountable to the party conference. So unlike the bourgeois parties and unlike Lassalleanism, this is a very much an accountable leadership in this way. Now, this is the model which is then developed when the SPD really begins to grow in the 1890s. It's the one that it builds on both the Eisenach tradition, but also the experience of the clandestine period as well. This is reflected, for example, in the annual party conference, in which delegates come from all over Germany, and which then elects the leadership. And it's reflected in the level of debate, and it's reflected in the way that politics are thrashed out. It's democratic centralist, I think, although we'll talk about how that term evolves a little later. But I think it's genuinely democratic centralist because it does have the centralizing element of a leadership, which, for example, directs the work of the party. Above all, it directs the work of the parliamentary fraction. It has the parliamentary, the Reichstag deputies under the control of the party. So it directs the work of the party, but it's accountable both to the party conference, and also there is, in many senses, another form of democracy, which is in the various localities. And this is the right of initiative and the right of activity to go on through local branches and through the local elements. Now, this doesn't mean, for example, that those local elements can, in a sense, go off and do their own thing. And indeed, we'll talk about how that works. But it does mean that in comparison with what we might think of later on in terms of both Bolshevik organization, although I'll perhaps explain, quite how that argument developed, but above all in terms of Stalinism, that the centralization is very much subject to what's happening in the localities. It means, for example, although there's a central party organ, which again we'll perhaps discover has a certain contradiction, it's the Berlin regional party Vorwärts. The paper is the sort of party organ, but it's also essentially under the control of the Berlin organization. The localities have their own newspapers, and they have essentially their own activities and a degree of autonomous, independent action. And this is the idea that democracy, and indeed discussion and disagreement, is absolutely the lifeblood of the movement. Now, this, I think, does run counter to the fairly militarized, and indeed what I would suggest is the bureaucratic form that is often taken to be the Bolshevik form, the so-called party of a new type. I would argue that is the product of a particular period in the Civil War, and then in the 20s, and that is not really both the tradition of pre-1917 or pre-1920, 21 Bolshevism. And it's certainly not really part of the Marxist tradition, which emphasizes, freedom of discussion, disagreement, the right of different tendencies and so on to publish their own newspapers and to express their own ideas. It means, for example, that in German social democracy, you have something like 75 different papers. Now, many of these will just be papers that reprint the line of Vorwärts. Many of them will just reproduce articles, but many of them will have local differences, and indeed there will be plenty of opportunity within those papers to put forward different views. If you want to think how this operates, one of the reasons why we've got so much written material by Rosa Luxemburg, particularly in the period from 1904, 1905 up until 1914, is that she is at one point the editor of the Leipziger Volkszeitung, and she's able to write and put forward ideas that challenge the party leadership, and indeed take different views. And this, of course, can be replicated across the SPD. The same, of course, is true not only of the left, but also it's true of the right, so that the so-called revisionist current can publish its newspapers, indeed can get control of newspapers. So what you have within this movement is, I think, a a much greater degree of discussion than we would see in most groups now that claim to be followers of the Marxist tradition, so that differences are openly aired in the pages of the press, and disagreements come out, very clearly in that way. And we've evidence of this simply by the articles that are written. We know that it's going on. And the same, of course, is true for the Bolshevik tradition as well. And indeed the Menshevik or the Russian social democratic tradition, we have the same sort of patterns. So this emphasis on democracy and accountability, but also on the importance of central direction, and indeed the idea of a degree of discipline around agreed tasks, is, I think, quite important. Now, we can already see some sort of tensions in this, and what I want to do is to sort of look at some of those tensions and indeed to see how they might operate. The tensions were not simply around political disagreements. Comrades will be aware of the revisionist controversy. I perhaps will steer clear of that because I'm largely talking about organizational form, and there isn't a simple mapping in many ways between revisionism and opposition to some elements of what I'm describing. Indeed, some of the revisionists were fairly clearly in favor of this form of party structure. But what it does reflect, I think, is the tendencies towards what we might think of as federalism, and indeed, forms almost, I suppose, of semi-anarchism. And what the model is attempting to do is to combine the maximum amount of freedom and democracy with accountability, but also with central direction. So that means that the party bodies, the higher bodies, can control and can direct the lower bodies. But it means that should a higher body carry out an action or order something that clearly is not supported, then appeals to the party conference or indeed in other forms can take place. In practice, the leadership, I think, gauged what would and wouldn't work. And indeed, there is, I think, something of a balancing act. And indeed, in the hands of people like, Wilhelm Liebknecht, but Bebel above all, the balancing between the left and the right is very much a political action, and indeed does I think become something of a way of life for Bebel, particularly towards the end of his life. But where we would see this particular type of relationship is the control that the party would exercise over its parliamentary delegations, and there are several famous examples of where parliamentary deputies who had, for example, taken an independent position were recalled or were disciplined in various ways, where attempts were made to make them resign, and it was made fairly plain that as parliamentary representatives, they were the representatives of the SPD. Their mandate came not from their electoral mandate, but it came from the working class and their position as representatives of the SPD. So the SPD, the workers' movement, controlled its deputies in this way. And that control was initially carried out by the executive, the Vorstand, and it would be exerted. There are two quite famous cases of this, although there are other examples of where this tension develops, particularly in the years leading up to the First World War, particularly as many of the parliamentary fractions start to develop not just revisionist positions, but positions that really break the bounds of the SPD's tradition in terms of voting for armaments expenditure, particularly naval expenditure, positions taken on the colonies, and in some instances taxation and indeed other areas to do with the military. Why we understand, or why we know how the SPD saw itself, and indeed saw the relationship between this leadership and its fraction, but also its relationship between the leadership and its membership, why we know this exists and the way that it works is through the debates around these cases. The Scheppel case is quite an important one. A member of the fraction who votes for naval expenditure, but the one that is quite well documented, and indeed Ben Lewis has translated some of the material about this, the so-called Göre case, concerns a deputy who is recalled by the SPD, and his local organization actually support him. And the SPD say, we as the central leadership of the whole of the workers' movement in Germany, we override that. And we are recalling him, and we're disciplining him. And what's interesting is that he relies upon a parliamentary mandate saying that the electors in Saxony voted for me or will vote for me. And the local party says, well, he's our choice, we think he's very good, and so forth. But the party leadership argues that it has a wider responsibility to the whole of the German workers' movement. And the case does go through various party bodies, and it is supported. But what's interesting about the arguments that Kautsky and others put forward is that this is clearly shows that the conceptions of democracy are not simply those of parliamentary democracy, and they're not simply, local autonomy. They're actually with a degree of centralism and a degree of direction, which is accountable to the party as a whole, throughout the whole of Germany, not just to the local branches in Saxony. Now, why I think this is important, and this is perhaps where I'm just going to wrap up, is the impact of this sort of practice, and indeed this idea, on other socialists in Europe, and particularly the debate about the historical origins of the idea of democratic centralism. Now, there's been quite an extensive work of historiography, and again, as I say, this involves comrades whose knowledge of German and Russian and other sources means that they're able to look at those sources. The interesting point is how far this degree of centralization, which is, I think, an important part of the workers' movement, and I would argue, indeed, is an important part of the revolutionary movement from the time of the French Revolution. Comrades will remember that the Jacobins were in favor of the Republic indivisible, and the Girondins and the Federalists were those who wanted much weaker central power. And the argument was that to defend the revolution, you needed the centralization of power in that way. And indeed, Lenin's writings in other aspects of political organization, for example, on the nature of the democratic republic, and of course Marx's own work in relation to Germany with a single German republic, not a loose federation. So the idea of centralization as an effective way of organizing politically, or indeed of organizing the state, is, I think, very central to revolutionary practice. But what I think is important in the German practice is the combination of that with democracy and accountability, and above all, of freedom to express opposition, and indeed to take that to the level of publication in that way. The work that I've seen seems to suggest that the actual phraseology, democratic centralism, occurs in Russia in around about 1905. In other words, around about the same time these discussions are going on in German social democracy. There's a reorganization commission taking place from 1904 to 1905. And we know from both references in Lenin's work, not just What Is to Be Done, which of course predates that, but in a number of other pamphlets, there are direct references to that. It means then that the idea of combining centralized leadership with democratic accountability is clearly part of German practice, and I think is part of that of Russian practice as well. The transformation of that idea of democratic centralism, of the emphasis on the centralism, and indeed the idea of the party of the new type, which is organized in semi-military and indeed, I think, quite bureaucratic terms, is, I think, a product of a later period. It's a product of the Russian Civil War, and that, I think, is, you know, a separate discussion. We will need to talk about Stalinism, and we will need to talk about, you know, that sort of development. We will need to contextualize it. But the ideas of democratic centralism as they exist up until 1914 and are common in both German social democracy and in Russian social democracy, I think, do follow this format. What occurs at various points as we move both towards the First World War, but also as we start to see the political challenges open up. Now, by 1912, the Social Democrats are the largest party. They've got 34% of the poll. They've got 110 deputies. And so the issues of control and of the party controlling those deputies, you know, obviously are going to come up. But the issue of the issue, I think, of democratic centralism and how we organize a party, I think there are clear lessons in this for us, not only because of the fact that it builds on a fairly respectable and indeed revolutionary Marxist tradition, but also because, you know, in many ways, the First World War and what comes after does represent something of a break with that tradition. And I think that the sort of parties of the left that have come into existence since then, particularly of comrades who regard themselves as Marxists, have not preserved particularly the democratic element and the tradition of open discussion, which is really so important to German social democracy and Russian social democracy. Anyway, comrades, I'll leave it there and throw it open to questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, comrade. Yes, if you have any questions or would like to make a contribution, please click raise hand, which is under reaction, or put it in the chat and I'll bring you in. Just a quick question here from Matthew in the chat. Do we know how big the SPD apparatus was? How many comrades did it employ? I just tried to find it out briefly. I can't see anything. I think it's also, I mean, coming out of illegality, etc., there weren't that great figures, and there wasn't membership structures either until early 1900. And so I think the membership figures, they rose from 380,000 in 1906 to over 1 million in 1914.
Yeah,
I've seen that. It's all I could see was it was a relatively small apparatus. There weren't that many full-timers. It was often comrades who couldn't get a job who ended up working for the party. But also, just quickly sharing this, which is kind of interesting, is the party school, which I found is quite a good one. That was founded in 1906, and this is the timetable. Hardcore. It is from morning 8 o'clock till about 3 or 4 o'clock, with 1 hour of lunch, and they're powered through, you know, historical materialism, unionism. You had Pannekoek was a teacher, Hilferding was a teacher, Rosa Luxemburg was one of the teachers, and they discussed discussed things, they wrote essays, they had, I think, tests as well and things like that. And they learned how to use the press, which I find interesting. Zeitungstechnik, I think they had to use the press, but also print themselves, I guess they learned, etc. So they used this for political as well as practical, education of comrades, which is quite sophisticated and quite cool if we had one of them, wouldn't it, to learn all that stuff. And they trained 200 in the 8 years that it existed between 1906 and 1914, and then they closed it down, unfortunately. There's still one around, but it's not like that. Do you know anything more about how big the apparatus was, how many people worked for the party?
Well, I think your point is right. It's actually quite difficult to sort of tell who is a sort of an apparatchik, as it were. I think that the way to look at it is that you would have the Vorstand would be full-timers who would be supported by the party. I think that in the party newspapers, you would have editorial staff and printers who would be, again, party employees. But although I think the party newspapers would also be supported by advertising and other commercial activities. And even some British, this wasn't unusual, even some British socialist newspapers, local socialist newspapers, had wide enough circulations to, get people put advertising in them, not necessarily sympathizers. It wasn't, in that way. There are two studies I've looked at in English. One is in Göttingen, the other one is in Hamburg, and they would suggest that the formal party apparat would be quite small, as Tina suggests, but then there would be, I suppose, what you might think of as, if we take the Vertrauensmänner, by the way, that becomes Vertrauenspersonen.
I was going to say, yes.
If you try to work on the basis of 75 newspapers with maybe 5 or 6 full-time staff and then a set of stringers, you can probably work at a party apparat of probably a couple of thousand. But if we take Rosa Luxemburg, she was funded by the party, but she was, primarily an educator and a newspaper editor. So I think we're looking at a couple of thousand. Tina's right on the membership. It is a fairly small apparat. You would probably, I'm thinking of the careers of people like Ebert, who would start off as, say, the party secretary somewhere, who would be a volunteer, would then move up, say, to, a wider area, might well become full-time. But I don't think you have a very big apparat. We're not looking at, sort of tens of thousands. But,
and do you think it was locally organized as well? Did the local organization decide who they're going to employ, etc.? And perhaps
it was a bit of both. It was a bit of both. You would have, this is where the centralization issue comes in. If somebody was plainly not up to it, for example, say like the secretary for Bavaria, then the central organization would sort of say, well, Comrade X is not really any good at this. But there would be, I suppose, a degree of local basis. You can see this actually as well. I didn't mention it, sorry, because it is reasonably significant. But if you think about the political battles, particularly in the southern German states, Baden, Bavaria, and Hesse, these are areas in which the revisionist tendency is strong, and indeed starts to enter into political deals in the various Landtage, this does lead to battles, and it sort of shows some ways the sort of limits of the centralization. but also it shows that sort of almost that balance, and the fact that the party organization is dominated by by revisionists or those, for example, are willing to work with bourgeois parties, shows that the party doesn't sort of carry out centralized purges of the apparat. So I think you do have quite a lot of local initiative in that way. I also think that it does become more of an issue, not just because we're moving towards the First World War. It's not a sort of sense everybody knew the war was coming, or although in a sense they did, but political issues, particularly around taxation, and particularly that argument that the job of socialists was to build a conscious working class that did not become involved in bourgeois politics, and particularly that famous slogan, "Not a penny and not a man," when you were starting to enter into arrangements in the various land assemblies, or you were voting for taxation on the basis that it was wealth taxation, but it would go on to fund military expenditure, you're already sort of seeing problems. And this is where I suppose the organization is only as good as the politics, and particularly the role of the center. And I don't mean that in the German sense, the Zentrale, the sort of party bureaucracy. I mean that tendency which sort of is from whence we get the phrase centrist in Marxist terms, that was sort of moving between the revisionists like Vollmar and Bernstein and then the left. And that's then, I think, shows that organization is important, but it's essentially politics, in that way.
Organization follows politics, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, if you take Vollmar, for example, Vollmar, who is a revisionist and indeed, is Bavarian, he's a very strange character. I thought Lassalle was bad enough in terms of the sort of exotic, but he was a landowner and also a former member of the Papal Guard. He volunteered in the Papal Guard and still remained a practicing Catholic. He ran into lots of problems with Babel on the women's question. But the fact that he still remained quite an important figure and indeed presented the organizational report, which essentially talked about this issue of centralization and the relationship with the regions and the localities and so on, shows that it wasn't simply that the left advocated this. It was indeed, a part of the general culture of German social democracy.
Can we talk about briefly then about the development of the term of democratic centralism? Firstly, did they use that phrase, or did it just sort of develop and you given it that phrase now in hindsight? And then secondly, how much was it tested in terms of, you have democratic centralism usually has two aspects, doesn't it? It has the freedom, and you have open debate and, ideally in the newspapers in front of the working class, so that the working class can learn from differences and make up its own mind and be convinced of a different opinion perhaps. But then also the unity in action part. You can have biggest freedom, as wide-ranging debate as possible, but when it comes to a particular action, that's usually the other side of the coin, isn't it? When it comes to particular action, you go as one, you strike as one fist, you keep, you have the differences up to a particular point. You can discuss a particular action if you're not, in favor of it, but when it comes to the action, then the majority decides. Was that tested often, at all, ever, to your knowledge?
Yeah, well, it was tested, I think, considerably. The democracy part, we can see, did function reasonably well, although, if you think about the instances when, and there are a few of them, when Kautsky, for example, wouldn't print certain material in Die Neue Zeit by Luxembourg, And but she was able to print it in, the Leipziger Volkszeitung. So that you could argue that editors, I mean, writers and editors spend their time today in the same sort of thing, arguing that you're not going to print my article in the form I put it in, or I'm not going to print your article. So you might argue that some of the criticisms that some of the left made were held back, but they were not suppressed. And I suppose the big difference, and many of the comrades in this meeting will have been in parties and groups where there might well be disagreements with inside the closed doors of the group, but those never sort of spill out, and it's only when there's a split that we, and comrades walk out, that we hear there's been this long-running debate on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, or whether China is socialist, or, well, we can think of lots of examples like that, so in that sense, I think the democracy did work, and the fact that Luxembourg and the others were able to function as an opposition, I think, does say something to that. I think where the politics come in, and this is maybe, some comrades may argue that this is a organizational fault, or they may well say it's a political fault, and I think they're right, is that I think that there was a tendency, and this is where I think we do, see that the actions, say, of those deputies in the South, which clearly ran counter to the dominant line, were actions which should have been suppressed much more. And I think that we can begin to see there some of the tendencies towards sort of conciliationism there. So in terms of the sort of bigger actions, if you think of the campaigns around suffrage or other activities, then the SPD did, I think, function. And in terms of political organization and advancing its politics, it did work in that way. But much of what is happening, and the revisionism debate, and then how we see the nature of the party, and indeed how we see the nature of socialism, I think is sort of then tied into it. So I don't think we can sort of distinguish that. But one of the things that is often argued, and Michel's in his famous book on oligarchy, Michel's, who was a former social democrat, he talked about this iron law of bureaucracy, and he used the SPT as an example of it, and that has led many people to sort of argue that the centralization was something of a sham, or sorry, that the democracy was something of a sham, and that it was really just harmless letting off steam, and that essentially the leadership, which was particularly the centrist leadership, was moving to the right, and there's a whole sort of debate about what happens in 1914 and what indeed happens afterwards. And I think that we do have to think about that. We can't just sort of take the organization in isolation. We can't just say, what's going on in German society. But I don't think it can, in organizational forms, I think it's a form that we can certainly look at, and I think attempt to emulate ourselves, or at least look at the rationale for it. And, particularly the idea of not just discussion, but the control of elected representatives, and indeed the trade union bureaucrats and so forth. But I think it's far from perfect. I mean, anybody who says that this is, a perfect system and that it worked brilliantly well, is, I think, exaggerating. But likewise, those comrades who just say, well, the SPD was rotten at the core from, somewhere about 1895 or 1899, I think that's also, very badly wrong.
I obviously agree with you. I think there's lots to learn from it. It's also interesting, the elected representatives, they, today you have an MP being elected and that's basically it. They can more or less do what they want unless they're under the whip, etc. But this is in Britain. I think it's much stronger than in Germany, say, where it's relatively, you can more or less do what you want and you can't be recalled, obviously. The situation with Karl Liebknecht then is quite interesting, then, isn't it? Because he, at the beginning, the first vote on war credits, he stuck with what he was told to do, which clearly was wrong, voting for war credits, and then he said, well, I'll now vote against it. So there is, it's not always a good thing if you're the representative of the party and you take that mandate rather than, the mass of the people don't perhaps want war, etc. That's a tricky.
I think we go to a wider question, and it's like the argument about, is the party always right? And then we're now moving into issues which must have come up for many comrades in the Bolsheviks and the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, particularly those who spent a lifetime and then found themselves in a party which was clearly becoming not just, bureaucratic, but actually a sort of, I think, a murderous police machine. And, it does, it's where I suppose you have to think about, it is almost a sort of an issue of conscience, I suppose, your Marxist conscience, your Marxist politics. If Liebknecht had been alone and he'd been the only one in the whole SPD, he would have been right. But he might well have doubted his sanity. He might well have thought, well, am I the only person who takes this line? And the fact was that he had good comrades around him, again, they're very small. So I think we are starting to move into this idea of, is the party always right? And I think if you grew up in a sort of militarized party tradition, which is that everything that's coming down from the top is like an order, like an army order, and you don't question it, then it's very easy to do that. If you're used to democratic discussion and the idea of looking at it and saying, well, look, I don't agree with this. But you're right, his initial response, and those of other left deputies, was to follow the tradition of, the fraction and the leadership. So, it is a case of where the centralism, was operating in a very anti-democratic way. But,
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. Okay, we've got some people from the floor now. Peter was the first one with his hand up. Hi.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great stuff. Yeah, I think that, this, the concept and the organizational form of, democratic centralism, I think it's something that Marxists, I've known for quite a while, they're in agreement with, and I'm just wondering about the emphasis of, when you have democracy as an aim, but also the need to be centralized, then obviously that there's a tension there, and Kevin's spoke to that tonight. But in terms of the organization, like the politics, the organization itself, the political party. Has a certain politics that it pursues, and the kind of politics that it pursues can redefine the difficulties, the tensions, and the very nature of what's termed democratic and centralist. So I'm wondering, when Kevin gave his example of the SPD, which is the focus tonight, where he was looking at the tensions, and he mentioned the MPs, the delegates getting elected to Parliament, and then one or two of them seeing their ideas, their individual politics and point of views as being fundamental in how they went about the business in Parliament, which was out of line with the Congress and the the party leadership. But in one case, it wasn't out of line with the local party. And I'm wondering whether the emphasis on, because the SPD, as far as I'm aware, emphasised parliamentary activity, then that kind of politics of parliamentarianism and slowly accreting, more kind of, reforms, more, democracy for the working class. Whether that emphasis on parliamentary politics was the key issue here in the problem that the SPD encountered. What I'm trying to get at is that if the politics is kind of based on parliamentarianism, and the idea is that the party work, apart from in the wider society, where it was pointed out by Kevin that you had educationals, sports organisation, leisure clubs, and all the rest of it. So they're the groundswell of movement in that sense. But the politics was emphasised in terms of parliamentary activity. Then that kind of like weakens and colours the attempt to deliver democratic centralism. I'm thinking in terms of the difference with the Bolsheviks. And so, I don't think there's probably any dispute that democratic centralism as an idea crossed over from Germany to Russia, because the leaders of these organisations were in constant contact with each other and circulated within Europe. And so that's not an issue. But the issue is like the colour and the nature of democratic centralism according to the politics that's pursued. Because we can look, and the case Kevin mentioned, Michel, and this idea of bureaucracy, which he took from Weber, and obviously it's an important thing, bureaucracy, but it can feed into any modern organisation with the best will in the world, and so if we look at the Bolsheviks, then they had a different kind of politics, which was based on not just parliamentarianism as a kind of key focus, but also the Soviets, when 1917 came about. And so that situation where the wider politics were pursuing like a dual power, I think was kind of the best operational grounds, if you like, or fertile grounds for the fuller development of that dialectic between democratic and centralization. And, because you had the Soviets on one side and you had the tactics of entering parliament on the other and taking state power. And so, I think that my essential point, just to come back to that, is that it isn't just organisational matters that matter. We can't judge the SPD in the 1870s and as it developed and compare them to Bolsheviks just on party organisational efficiency and clarity and what kind they produced and what ways they see in democratic centralism. But it's how it's put to use within a revolutionary programme. And I don't know for sure whether the SPD had a revolutionary programme in the same way that the Bolsheviks defined it. And I think the other thing as well is that where this parliamentarianism falls down, the emphasis on it, is that at the time of the SPD, around the 1880s, to the demise, should we say, of the Second International, when they reached the peak in terms of a fully fledged Marxist organisation. At that time, from the 1870s onwards, as Marx warned, we had the emergence of a finance capitalist elite, even if Marx didn't spell it out too clearly. And we also have the beginnings of empire. And so, in that sense, while the SPD are growing with an emphasis on parliament, and trying to produce the right organisational form of the party. It's based around nationalism and parliamentarianism. When the ground for nationalism has been eaten away by capital because it's becoming more global, more international through finance capital, through the pillage of colonies, through the capital investments abroad, or in all the ways that Hilferding pointed out as a member of the SPD and then followed by Lenin. And so the ground from which a national politics, let alone a parliamentary one, could be won on socialist terms, had gone. And I think that is the kind of point that Lenin was raising about the differences between the SPD and the Bolsheviks. And that colours, to use a phrase that Kevin used before at the beginning of this talk, that colours our understanding of both. Because Lenin grasped this. Lenin grasped that the situation had gone global. Labour as a political organisation, as a socialist, as a basis for socialism, could only be grasped globally, because capital had become global in its makeup, in its policies abroad, and the way it used the state, the national state. And so those times of democratic republic based on a national framework have been swept aside, and there had to be an insurrection with a direct focus on socialism led by the working class. And I think that's where the organisational form of democratic centralism finds its true home. And it to me, it might have been invented somewhere else, but by the SPD, but it was a poor a replica, a phantom of what it could have been in the right circumstances with the right politics based on shaping society politically to achieve socialism. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Do you want to reply to that, Kevin, straight away?
Yeah, I'll come back because there's quite a lot there. I think the key word is parliamentarianism, and I think in particular the strategy that I'm talking about, and certainly the one that Engels is advocating, isn't parliamentarianism. It's the use of elections as a way of recording strength, and it's also the use of elections, and particularly the sort of deputies as tribunes and as sort of socialist agitators in that way. Now, that's how I think the strategy began, but I think that you're quite right that certainly by we can think of various dates, and I certainly think it's very clear from 1905 that quite large parts of the leadership, or at least the leading elements, and the revisionists in particular, have become parliamentarian, but there is still a left. And I think that the organizational form that we've talked about is still one that's predicated on leading the working class to power. So I think your sort of idea that work in parliament or parliamentarianism, we're probably looking at a later period, and I think if we look, for example, at what Lenin's writing about the SPD up until 1914, and indeed his obituary on Babel, he is still not really drawing out those differences in the way that you suggest in terms of parliamentarianism. I think that, you can come back in a minute, Peter, if you want. Or if you want to say something now.
Sorry, the mouse is playing up there. Yeah, Kevin, just to kind of like clarify, I don't think Lenin suddenly knew all along, and I think he was as blind as everyone else, but he kind of reacted in a better way, I think, than later on, and began to look at finance,
yeah,
capital,
yeah.
and all the rest anyway.
Yeah, no, but I mean, my argument is not that this model, or indeed, I'm not here to defend the SPD leadership, and indeed, I think that the politics and your point about sort of socialism in one country, which is already being flagged, and indeed in the discussions on the colonial question, is already being flagged, is a clear sign of the way that the sections of the party are moving, and how far that reflects structures in German society, the labor bureaucracy, and so on, I think is is important. But I don't think that this becomes fully apparent until 1914, and I don't think that Lenin develops the sort of strategy that you're talking about and until really 1917 itself. And I think that he, like many of the Bolsheviks, is still very clearly influenced by the SPD model. I mean, we can look at left-wing communism and the sort of advice that he's giving, to communists in Western Europe, and about the use of parliament in that way. But I think that, I was very struck with the work of August Nimz about Lenin's sort of lines on elections, and how he was following large parts of what the SPD were doing and saying in the in this period. I think you're quite correct about the issue of imperialism, and I think you're correct to point out that that much of what the SPD is attempting, and I've referred to their role in the Second International, does tend towards the idea that socialism is possible in one country. And I think that not only does the Russian Revolution disprove that, but the way you've described imperialism as a system means that a revolutionary movement is going to have to be international, and is again going to have to, at the very least, be a European style. And I think that again, that was something that Lenin advocated, but Kautsky was also putting forward similar arguments about the role of Russia in 1905 as well. So I think that it wasn't, that the party, and indeed his position, was one that could see, a road for this. Just on this point, there's an interesting discussion that will be taking place at 10 o'clock this evening after this meeting. I mean, it's not organised by us, but Mike Tabor has got a book launch about debates in the Second International. I don't know if Peter and other comrades are aware of Mike's work on the politics of the Second International. Not only has he produced the resolutions of the Second International, but he's also got some of the debates. And I think what's interesting, when you look at some of the contributions of some of the German delegates, you can clearly see some of the points that you're making, but you can also see oppositional positions as well. I think it's this idea of the role of Parliament and the role of the use of bourgeois democracy as a means of mobilizing workers and of developing socialist consciousness. And I think that is still, even today, still a lesson that we can draw. As I say, left-wing communism certainly turned on that. I think if you look, though, at where the tendencies towards not only bureaucracy, but accommodation with the status quo come in, are simply that the strategy for that transition and what that transition means, whether, for example, it occurs through a form of breakdown, or whether, as the revisionists are suggesting, a la the Fabians, that in a sense it sort of grows into, some form of socialism. I think if we're looking at the weakness of the centre, and I would suggest even of the German left, it's actually the means by which that emancipation takes place. And that, I think, is not just a parliamentary sin. I mean, I think that parliamentarianism and the work in Parliament can encourage that, but I think there are again more fundamental political points. It's quite possible to use Parliament, and I go back to left-wing communism. I think it's quite possible to use Parliament without being parliamentarian, and I think just merely the use of bourgeois institutions doesn't make you, a parliamentarian. But I certainly agree in terms of which is drawn, quite a lot from the Fabians. I mean, Bernstein spent a lot of time in Britain and imbibed that. And you can sort of see the logic of it in terms of the development of German capitalism. And of course, the way a lot of these people are going to go in the First World War, you'll find that many of them will become very pro-war and indeed will become quite Kaiserreich. But of course, there are people on the left who also take that line, who might well have been, for example, opponents of participation in Parliament, or indeed of, who came from the left. I mean, Parvis is a good example, although he's a rather, individual one. But the fact that Bernstein and Kautsky take different lines on the war than we might well have expected, I think that this sort of parliamentarianism angle is, there is more to it than merely participating in Parliament.
Thank you. William is next.
So thank you, Kevin. I must say, very enjoyable and very rejuvenating subject that I haven't studied this quite a few years. Now, the situation that I would feel how it all fell down was at the outbreak of World War I. The whole of the socialist movement, whether they were democratic centrists or whether they were anything else, just fell apart. In Britain, Keir Hardie was stuck to his guns, made a very fantastic speech at the outbreak of World War I, and then died 6 weeks later of a broken heart. Lenin opposed World War I, and the only two national groups that opposed World War I on the socialist side was Connolly's Irish Republican Socialist Party and Lenin's Communist Party of Russia. Now, in Ireland, we had two socialist movements at the time. There was another one called the Independent Labour Party, which was a unionist-based left-wing party run by William Walker. Now, Walker supported the British Empire in their analysis of the African situation. He felt that colonialism and imperialism was an advance. It brought uncivilized people, as he called them, into the modern world. There were people on the left in Germany also had the same position. And if anything, Rosa Luxemburg was moving towards that position. So after, what do you feel of our analysis? We say, like, we take pride that Connolly held to his guns and that kept the Irish working class, told the Irish working class to stay out of the war with a slogan, "We serve neither king nor Kaiser but Ireland." So.
Thank you, Conrad. Kevin, do you want to speak on that?
Yeah, thanks, William. I think Connolly is worthy of another discussion, and I think over in Donegal, I think you would agree that Connolly's role is an important one. I think that the First World War is a very clear dividing line, and I think that many socialists were disoriented by it. I mean, obviously the pro-imperialists, sided with their own side, but I think opposition to that war and the nature of opposition to that war and how it was to be conducted also led to, a great deal of confusion. I'm thinking particularly of pacifism and the various tendencies that that were emerging there. The social pacifists, and then those who were calling for various forms of peace conference and so forth. I think that Lenin's and Connolly's positions were slightly different. Indeed, I think Connolly's position, insofar as I have read a lot of it actually, and I think that Connolly took a different position to Lenin. I think, we know that Lenin and indeed Trotsky and other revolutionaries saw, the Easter Rising as an important aspect of turning the First World War, into from an imperialist war into a civil war. But I think that Connolly's politics were different. I don't think that they developed along similar lines to those of Lenin, and I think it doesn't dishonor Connolly, or it doesn't argue that he he took the wrong position or anything of that sort, because I don't think that he did. But he's clearly working on a very different perspective. He's very much cut off from, I think, developments in Europe, and I think that he's not really looking in terms of a wider European revolution at that point. But I think that you're right to point out, the role of social imperialism, and even in Ireland, where you had not just the sort of Labour bureaucracy in the 6 counties, or what would become the 6 counties, but the participation of bourgeois nationalists in the First World War, that the sort of pressures on socialists like Connolly, were immeasurably great. I think also the role of the British Labour Party and its incorporation into the state. Again, quite a lot of people in Britain would tend to see the Labour Party as sort of, having been, originally once basically sound. But I think its role in the First World War proves that in many ways it had always been a sort of bourgeois workers' party. And perhaps more importantly, its role in dealing with the Easter Rising, something which I always remind those comrades in Britain who tend to think of the Labour Party as once being a socialist party, reminding them that Arthur Henderson sat in the war cabinet that allowed Connolly to be executed. So that's not just a sort of like a little minor mistake. I mean, essentially Henderson and the Labour Party are taking part in the war and on the side of the bourgeoisie. But I think a discussion of Connolly's politics is important, and I hope maybe at some stage we will look at it. And some of my first pamphlets were reading Connolly in the late 1960s, those little ones that were produced by the Irish Communist Party, and then some even by the Labour Party in the days of the Liaison Committee of the Left and Michael D. Higgins. See how far they've all come now. Anyway, thanks, William. Just a matter of interest, whereabouts are you in Donegal?
John Mood.
I'm in Glencullen. I only briefly answer that. Lenin wrote a very particular critique of Connolly, where he supported everything he'd done. And the only criticism he could make of Connolly was that Connolly went too early. If Connolly had waited till the Russian Revolution and then had his revolution, that could have led to a revolution in Britain as well. That's what Lenin wrote. Trotsky did not in any way support Connolly, but Lenin most emphatically supported Connolly, 100%.
Okay,
and just on a personal note, I spent many happy holidays in Glencullen, William. Yeah.
I know you did, because I met you there.
Oh,
he's forgotten all about it.
Tobron Oram. Vi meg follow Gaelge.
I tell you, yeah, vi follow Gaelge. Vi follow Gaelge. I miss I follow Gaelge fashion.
To
Oh,
be
well, I'm sure
continued.
Yeah.
No, we're having a private discussion now. That's all. By the way, they spoke Gaelic in England at one time before the Romans decided to capture us. Okay.
Okay, well, you two get a room in Donegal or wherever. Okay.
Okay, there you go.
Ian, please.
Good evening, comrades. Yeah, excellent conversation, excellent discussion. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I just wanted to raise two little points. Firstly, the very positive aspect of the flourishing of theory at the time, and how the debate in the party led to a flourishing of theory. And of course, that's really quite different from a lot of people's experience of Marxist parties subsequently. With some exceptions. I'm not saying there's nothing going on, but just that interesting point that there was this flourishing of theory and a relative paucity, I would suggest, today. The other point I wanted to make was to what extent had the party had its day? Because of course the name of Pannekoek being mentioned as somebody teaching on the SPD school, his subsequent response, and one of the people who was attacked by Lenin, left-wing communism, in that book is named as Horner, but it was Anton Pannekoek. From Pannekoek's point of view, the party, as it was in the Second International, was really shaped by the politics of declining capitalism. And from his point of view, of course, he took the council communist position of saying the expression of proletarian interests is actually in workers' councils. And of course, it's more complicated than that, and it was difficult at the time because, after all, even the workers' councils that were thrown up in Germany, so some of them were hardly radical at all. I mean, even Max Weber was a member of a workers' council at one point in Germany. But of course, you do see, on the one hand, later on, the Bolsheviks, the Constituent Assembly is closed down in favor of the Soviets, but by 1920, the Soviets themselves are completely impotent. And of course, the tendency is, in looking back, to regard the various splits that took place in the workers' movement in Germany in the aftermath of the First World War as being catastrophic. But I think, from the point of view of someone like Pannekoek, the SPD had nothing left to offer. The party form had nothing left to offer, and of course, but that revolution was defeated, and the Russian Revolution was defeated. So the question is about the party form and whether it's more. Is it just about democratic centralism, or is there something more profound? I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Quite the question. Kevin, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That's an easy one. Well, in some ways, you might well have thought, at various stages, for example, in 1914, you might well have thought that, parties had become absorbed into the state. And, Michel's sort of took that view in terms of bureaucracy, and, that type of argument could develop in a left direction, that the party is now, rather like the Labour aristocracy, and therefore, is this, we need to go to fresh elements, and you're talking about council communism and so forth. I suppose the way I look at it is partly our experience since then, and I'm thinking of examples of revolutionary movements where there hasn't been a party form, but there's been plenty of spontaneity. And also, I suppose, the ideas of sort of preparation and indeed of developing consciousness. We're all aware of sort of movements that emerge, and we know that they throw up all sorts of politics, and periodically some of those politics take positive forms and indeed lead towards revolutionary movements. But I'm not sure of an experience where, without some form of party and some sort of current in terms of its organization, and above all, the idea of, I suppose, ultimately education, but of developing that revolutionary consciousness. So if we think of that consciousness developing spontaneously, or that it can develop through organizational forms like Soviets, I think it certainly can move towards that way, but I think it still requires something which is, a party form. So I can understand comrades taking that line. I mean, I'm thinking of people who in, say, the 50s who've been in the, in the official communist movement, moved towards, not only Trotskyism, but they moved into forms of, some sort of anarchism or left communism, and saw the party as as the problem. I think it's how the party is organized, and indeed how the movement is organized, and that then, I suppose, comes to the question of the program as well. I don't want to perhaps bring it up too much to the contemporary, but I'm thinking of quite a lot of spontaneous sort of rank and file movements or networks. And these often sort of, I'll quote, decentralized and delayered and so on. But they often do have, in effect, party forms within them. And even if we think of it as a group of comrades who take a similar view and may not call themselves a party, they are acting effectively in that way. So at least the open existence of a party, as opposed to we're just a network and, there's no sort of party form, that I think is, makes it sort of obvious. But also, I think historical experience means that parties, as we understand them, of conscious activists who are trying to recruit for socialism and are trying to sort of direct struggles in a particular way, and also doing it, in an organized way, as opposed to, spontaneously or in an uncoordinated way. I think those are, the only forms I can think of. But if you, we have talked about this before, and I suppose it is this question of sort of democracy and centralization. But for me, the sort of politics, if you think of the sort of basic politics of the self-emancipation of the working class and the the transition to communism, that I think does require a party. And I just to repeat, I'm not sure the historical experience throws up any other form that can do it. I mean, even in the Soviets, if you think of them, they were organized as sort of party organizations. They may have emerged originally in that form, but I think they very quickly became party organizations. I think very few organizations that I know of, even the local fishing club has got different tendencies and factions in it. By the way, I'm the fixed ball real man tendency myself.
Ian, you want to have another go?
Yeah, I mean, probably already gathered that I'm simply being provocative, but I agree with you, but I think the one caveat I would add is that we should be prepared for the possibility of novel forms that will be thrown up in the future, and even at present. What was so striking, I think, about the period around the First World War, and why I mentioned it in conjunction with theory, is that there was that flourishing because it was a revolutionary time. We've lived through a period of historic defeat, and the forms that are going to be thrown up in the future are not necessarily the ones of the past. And of course, Soviets themselves. Trotsky's 1905 is such a magnificent book because he was there, and his discussion of the Soviets was so vivid. And I think, that notion of the development of theory, which is accelerated in revolutionary times, and so are political forms. But I'm absolutely not disagreeing with what you said.
You know, as a question to you then, Ian, I mean, how would you envisage it? I mean, if we say, you know, capitalism is not just national now, it is actually international. So the working class has to, you know, get organized on an international level. I mean, the party, I mean, it kind of depends on what you call it or not. I mean, if it's, you know, if it's some kind of, clearly it needs some kind of organization where we can talk to each other and we can organize horizontally, but also, I mean, at some stage, somebody somewhere or some decisions have to be made, you know. I mean, even with the best sort of intention, I can't think of anything that is more democratic, when it is democratic, than a party structure where you can recall people and you can, you know, you have open debate, etc. But then you act as one. I mean, can you think of structures that are more democratic than that, better perhaps?
I'm not sure we could even prefigure them. I mean, the reason why I'm interested in joining the Communist Party of Great Britain is precisely because it is open. It is a thinking party, as opposed to ones where you somehow have to try and make the facts fit the party line. It's one which is open to the idea of using a range of different media. I mean, the paper is probably the only one worth reading, but it's not the only medium that's used. And I think what we'll see, and I'm not arguing that this is just purely a technical question, but the fact that I could have a conversation with somebody in Yemen tomorrow is highly significant. But it will throw up different forms, and it's just a question of, I think, being aware of that possibility. At the moment, the party forms that we've got, well, you know, I agree, it has to be democratic, but it also can't be so. I mean, democracy is an interesting one as well, because let's remember that Karl Liebknecht was shouted down by a call for unity. It was Liebknecht that was regarded as being the person who was breaking with the party ranks, and it was Herbert and Nursk who had him killed. So, I mean, you know, in revolutionary times, things change very rapidly, and I think it's a question of being prepared for that, as well as prescribing a particular type of party form for today.
Thanks, comrade. Matthew, please.
Yeah, I think it's mostly in form of, you know, questions and so on. But I think there's, I mean, you know, obviously the party form is, in terms of what's just been said, the party form is absolutely necessary. You know, you can see what happens when you don't have one. You know, you lose. If you haven't got a political weapon, you know, you haven't got a culture or a political weapon that you can use to actually take on the capitalist class and the oppressors or whatever else, you lose automatically. That's the way it works. I think, I mean, the thing is, it's to try and get at, you know, the basis of the sort of culture of an organization. Isn't it? I mean, obviously, the comparison to the Bolsheviks and so on in Russia is not, you know, it's completely different, because obviously the Bolsheviks go through this, you know, and the other elements of the RSDLP go through these periods, both of which are, you know, obviously for being underground, in which, I mean, you know, the average active life of a cadre is about 6 months before they get arrested and thrown in jail or Siberia or exiled. So I mean, it's a, you know, quite an extraordinary organization in those terms, and clearly can't operate on a democratic basis. You know, with the periodic, you know, the explosions of 1905 is absolutely critical. With no 1905, you don't have 1917. You know, and then the growth of the party, you know, which takes place in these you know, explosions. You know, the establishment of the old Bolshevik cadre, which is, you know, essentially a few old guys and a bunch of people from 1905, and then of course the Civil War intake roughly from 1917 onward, and then of course, Stalin just swamps the lot with the Lenin levy and destroys the organisation effectively. So you get that sort of basis, but at the same time, obviously, under conditions in which operation of a democratic organisation over any prolonged period of time is extremely difficult. Whether that's being underground or the Civil War or whatever else. Whereas the SPD, it's then to say, okay, well, from experience, the problem in any organisation is you have factions, as a matter of course. The question is, are the factions honest? the question also then becomes, well, okay, how does the organisation actually function? So you start, how often do the branches meet? What sort of cadre have you got? What sort of political level have you got? Generally in Britain, the political level of activists has generally been pretty poor, because the level of understanding of Marxism in this country is generally pretty poor, and organisations have not, most of the organisations have not dedicated any real time to get people to think, to understand Marxism and to think for themselves, because all they want them to do actually is to run about. And they want to take orders, really. They don't want them to think and say, no, I don't agree with that. It becomes more difficult. And it's also, it's more difficult to operate in those terms. So have you got a cadre of people overall with an experience and understanding of politics who are going to question things that are done by so and so, who happens to be the regional secretary or such and such, who happens to be a member of Parliament, and all this sort of stuff. As I say, how often do your branches meet? Do you have things like union fractions and so on, in which you're trying to conduct an intervention? I mean, okay, obviously the unions is quite different, because clearly the SPD established the unions. Then it's a question of and the leadership of the unions were members of the SPD, but then the question is, well, what does the membership do? Does the membership of the union see itself as a means of a check again, or operating within those organisations, and checking the leadership and the full-time apparatus, and then of course, obviously, the structure at the top, when you've got a situation, clearly, usually you have a larger national body, which is runs on the basis of a representative body across the whole country or whatever else, takes in all the different bits, and then you have an executive, and the question is, well, what's the relationship between the two? An executive, a large national body will meet, monthly or whatever else, and the executive will usually meet, several times a week. So obviously you've got that sort of, how does that actually balance out, in terms of an internal life, and a political debate in the organisation, in which you actually sort of people can learn lessons. And the other problem, of course, you've got under conditions in what's happened really with most of the sects, of course, is that the leadership will say, well, we're always right, always. So you can't learn anything if you're always right. There's no point discussing anything, is there really? So people don't go through the mass experience and say, okay, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? What actually, how do we move this forward? Actually, what they generally do is to say, okay, well, we're right. We've always been right. You can't question us. We'll move on to the next thing. Keep running about people. And that's been the total experience for most people in these organisations. It's not, there's no reckoning. There's no account of whether or not success or otherwise, and that means learning lessons. And the question is, okay, in terms of like the culture, because obviously really, as I say, the SPD is quite a different form and under very, very difficult conditions than Russia. Obviously the Labour Party is absolutely different, because you have different organisations. Again, it's basically a federation of different organisations up until 1918, all of which have different cultures. But obviously the political level in Britain is always been worse. So it's quite a different situation. So interesting to see, if there's anything, in those terms, in terms of how that culture worked. I mean, that was the thing, you see. I mean, I remember, this is one of the comments of Serge after the Second World War, when he says, look, there are very few of us left. They've killed us. They've killed the entire Bolshevik, generation of Bolsheviks. All of them virtually. So nobody understands how Bolshevism worked, because they weren't there. They didn't see how it worked. And the thing is about that sort of culture is it's not much of it can be, some of it can be inferred, but unless you've actually been in it, it's very difficult to understand.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I think that was a really important final contribution, actually, and it's a good way, I think, to sum up the session, because we're not in favor of democracy or free speech because it's nice or we're nice people or something like that. But it is crucially important, isn't it, for a healthy organization to convince the working class that it can join our organization, because it doesn't mean you have to shut up afterwards. When you join a really democratic party, it means you flourish, your ideas are important, you've been asked to think and to speak up and to develop them and to perhaps even challenge the leadership if it turns out they're wrong and you're right, even though you're a minority at the beginning. So it gives the minority the chance to become the majority, which is hugely important. So it's a really, really important contribution then. And I'd leave it to Kevin to just have a few final words tonight.
Okay, thanks, comrades, and thanks for the questions and comments. I won't prolong it unduly. I think Ian's point about new political forms and what forms they'll take is an important one, because, of course, we were quite right when Soviets were new in 1905, and they were a new form, and indeed it took a certain amount of time for people to sort of recognize their significance. I think, though, the Russian Revolution is problematic in several ways, and by that I mean that quite a lot of comrades, I think, still see politics through the prism of the Russian Revolution. And that's not to deny its importance, but whether it's a model, and Lenin, I think, in left-wing communism is, arguing that, and whether we simply assume that any revolutionary movements in the future are going to take the form of the Russian Revolution, and indeed the sort of political forms that are going to be thrown up. I think we have to sort of accept that, it may be very different. For example, whether in societies with different economic forms, whether workplace Soviets will exist in that form, and whether other, forms of sort of, popular power. So, I think just as a sort of principle, we would need to consider that in that way. But I do think in terms of the issue of a party, and indeed its form, we do also have to look beyond the national, and we do have to look, I think, in terms of, in our immediate neighborhood, Europe, but also we need to think in terms of, for the reasons that Peter Kennedy in particular talked about, the nature of capitalism. We do have to talk about the fact that socialism in one country was never possible, but arguments that are based purely on national politics, which much of the left still does, particularly the left social democrats. I mean, if you think about the Corbyn program or Syriza's program, we're all based on the ability of those left governments, should they have come to power or come into office, I should say, to function. And it's very plain that we are now looking at, as I think, we were from the time of Lenin, we're now looking at much wider movements and indeed much wider party than simply national parties. But I still think those parties should be organized around the type of democratic centralism that we've discussed, and particularly the importance of democracy, because one of the things that sort of is rather like the elephant in the room, if we want to think of it, is, of course, the sort of inheritance of Stalinism, and indeed the impact of Stalinism. And I know that, Matthew, you often talk a lot about that, and I think you're right to talk about not only the way it affects our conceptions of politics, but also I think the forms and organizations of the party, and in particular the idea of the party of a new type, and the functioning of the party as a sort of clandestine, semi-militarized body. And I'm thinking particularly in terms of democratic discussion and the way that the party is organized. And the points you were making on that, I think, are really valid, because if we think about what Marxism and what it means in terms of developing as a movement, for the mass of the working class, we're talking about a mass vanguard party. Now, that seems a contradiction, but what the SPD was attempting to do was to create a mass party of high-level socialist militants and cadres, not just a set of activists, a set of followers. The job of the party school was to create leaders in the localities, not to simply create an elite. And I think that much of our, this moves on to wider politics in terms of what we demand, what sort of demands we're putting forward, and how we, view the sort of movements that we can build. But much of what we do in the existing left is, as you say, simply sort of activism, and it's not really raising the level and the culture. Ian was quite correct, I think, about the theoretical level. When you look at the sort of blossoming of political ideas in that period, this grew out, I think, of the understanding of the importance of ideas and the importance of developing a culture, not just turn up, sell the paper, chant the slogans, go on the demonstration. It's I think a much more serious task, and that's what I think is the job of a party. So I think the issue is one that will continue, and I think it's certainly one where we've got to look at the experiences of the Russian Revolution, particularly the militarized party form that developed in the Civil War, and we've got to look at the impact of that, and the impact it's had on our politics and our practice. And that's why I'm making a case for reclaiming this idea of democratic centralism, with the focus on democracy, but also on the focus on developing that consciousness under the sort of leadership and the development of a party that is of millions of people, not a small handful. Anyway, I will leave it there, comrades. I'm afraid I'm flagging a little bit. It's probably age.
Did a very good job, though. Thank you very much. It wasn't that many contributions, but quite lengthy one and thorough one. So thank you very much, comrades. Thank you, Kevin. I can see there's a couple of people with their hands up now, but it is 9 o'clock, so we have to bring this now to an end. Please join us next week when we're looking at Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and the Russian Marxists, which will be opened by Ian Spencer. Good night, comrades.